Okay, happy week number 9, I think that where we're at. 8 or 9. I think week number 9. Week number 8, I apologize. So this is the Friday, and instead of our normal Thursday morning and evening live online sessions, like I shared with you both on the course announcements and in the classroom, this week we covered the material through this Friday session. So without further ado, I do want to share a screen of mine with you, and we'll just take it from there. So there's really 3 components to what I was hoping to do today. First, I want to talk a quick kind of a crash course review of the respiratory system. So this covers most of the elements from what you've seen in the class lecture. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time playing around, dabbling into the clinical side of the things and having a look of the clinical review of the content for this week. And finally, I do want to spend just a moment going through the lab for this week. I know if you're joining me through a recording, that will mean that there's a little bit of material that we will cover, so I will provide a timestamp on the description of the video for each of these 3 different elements, so you can jump right where you want to be and get busy with that without too much looking around. The final kind of a reminder that I want to put out, or part of the plan, is that please remember that next week it's going to be our spring break. So there will not be any face-to-face or online teaching. Next week is a great chance for you to catch up on any assignments that you might have missed out. And I think I shared both on the announcements and in the classroom that I have made all these assignments available for you that you might have missed if you want to retake those or reattempt those. They're going to be available until the last day before the end of the spring break, which would be, I believe, Saturday 19th. So one day before the last day of the spring break, now that I get my head straight. So I encourage you to do those. If you feel that you want to attempt those points, do remember that I do offer additional chances to get extra credit points and so on. However, it is worthwhile to cover all of the learning material, but the choice is ultimately at this level of educational system on you. So let's get started with the respiratory system and having a look of that, and having a look of the kind of the lecture oriented material of what we should cover. And the format is going to follow that. We're going to start with some general concepts, then we're going to look at the anatomy of each of the structures that are important, and then we'll shift our gears and focus on the physiology side of the respiratory system. Certain elements of the physiology we will save for the lab and revisit those at that time. But I thought that it'd be nice to start by just kind of doing what I always try to do, which is trying to emphasize how it all comes together. And let's start off with a little bit of a chemical formula. I'm pretty sure that most of you will pick this up real fast, that what's happening here. It's something that you would have seen even in the past in your previous courses and so on. Let me just rectify that. So one of the most basic formulas that you might see. And we will discuss through it just as a chance to remind ourselves of what's going on. But as always, I encourage you to give it a go yourself as well, and see what can you recover from your memory in terms of what's going on here. I believe that you would have seen this formula during your Bio 181 or Bio 156, depending on whichever course you've taken, and that would seem fairly familiar. So of course, what we're seeing here is that I've just chosen a glucose molecule as an example of a sugar molecule, and they get converted, the energy stored into the sugars into ATP, which was the cellular energy currency. So how cells used, stored, moved energy in the cell to drive various different functions that we needed to do on a cellular level. So I don't think that there's anything highly surprising to you that that's what your body does. And if I really want to oversimplify the life, we could say that this is all your body does. Your body takes sugars from the nutrition. So let's add our digestive system here. So that's why we're going to be looking at the digestive system a little later on this semester, that how do we get these sugars into the body and utilized by the body. And of course, we saw that these were then the ATP used for driving many different body processes that were the basis of life. But you start to see real fast that we're faced with a need to deal with two things. We need to get some oxygen to the body, and we need to get rid of some of the carbon dioxide. So that's really gonna be the big emphasis of today's topic. So of course, the way how we get oxygen to the body is gonna be through respiratory system. And we get rid of the carbon dioxide through the respiratory system as well, to a part. There's going to be a little bit more to the story, but that gives us a kind of a starting point. And we also remember that we needed the cardiovascular system to move these gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, within the blood, so that they were either transported from the lungs to the tissues where they are needed, or from the tissues back to the lungs so we can get rid of those, depending whether we're talking about oxygen or carbon dioxide. You'll also see that we're left with something that we have not addressed, and it's really gonna be these hydrogen atoms that we're gonna deal with. And how do we get rid of the excess hydrogen? And that's where we're gonna be seeing the urinary system and talking about that in a greater detail. Not just now, but after spring break, paying a little bit more attention to that side of the house. But really what you're seeing here is that, I guess, that everything that your body does all these events, all these systems to facilitate this simple function. And like I said, our focus is now going to be how do we get some oxygen and how do we remove some carbon dioxide. And that really brings us to see these connections between different systems. And I already mentioned this, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But the respiratory system really relies on the cardiovascular system drastically. And then, of course, we had a little bit of leakage happening out from the cardiovascular system to the lymphatic system. We've already had a look of the immune system as well. So our focus now will be on the respiratory system, but every now and then you'll see that we'll dabble into the topics that you've seen before. Other thing that I wanted to mention just very, very briefly here at this point is that one of the things that you'll see why cardiovascular system is so incredibly important for us is that if we think of the really primary care or we think of the paramedics. What are their priorities? There might be a lot going on with the patient, but priorities are always secure that the airway is open. Make sure that breathing happens, and if breathing doesn't happen, then we start to mimic that through those rescue breaths that we've seen before. And then the third priority is going to be the chest compressions if there is no natural heartbeat, making sure that the blood is moving within the cardiovascular system. So really that shows you how important it is that we get the gases in, we get the gases out, and we help that process of moving them. Brain damage starts really, really fast if we fail to accomplish this. So that's why it's going to be a priority for us. I think we already visited this kind of a concept already earlier on in my opening part, so I'm just going to move on from that and draw our attention to what I just said, that the big function of the respiratory system is to ensure that we are supplying oxygen to the tissues that need those and remove carbon dioxide that's produced as a byproduct of this cellular respiration and get it away from the body. But there's going to be a bunch of other additional functions, such as, for example, respiratory system and nasal cavity. We'll see how important the sense of smell is going to be. We're going to see how respiratory system contributes also to the production of speech, which is one of the important means how we communicate in our modern society. So really, I guess that the big thing there that I'm trying to highlight is that these systems are connected to each other, and we see a lot of overlap. One thing that you'll see sometimes in the textbooks is that there are different kinds of ways of listing the different structures that are involved in the respiratory system and dividing them into two classes, mainly to the upper and lower respiratory tract. I wouldn't say that this slide that I'm showing you is very good. The boundary between the two is sometimes a little blurry, and I would probably rather draw the boundary here so that the nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, pharynx, and larynx belong to the upper respiratory tract, and trachea, branches of bronchioles, and lungs and alveoli belong to the lower respiratory system. But like I said, there's a little bit of disagreement, a little bit of depending on who you ask how this classification works. I could easily see that the upper part of the trachea would still belong to the upper respiratory system, and lower parts of the trachea to the lower respiratory system. So I'm okay with whatever you choose. You do you, boo. But what I want is that you are aware that there is that sort of an approach to this. If I were ever to ask you this in an exam as part of this course, I would probably ask some very simple, very obvious differences. So something from the very top, something from the very bottom of the list. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease when it comes to that. But I think we really should start our discussion of these different structures. So this is the skeleton, what you're seeing here, that we will use to review the anatomy of the respiratory system. So we'll go using these different structures, and we'll start from the very beginning. And we should ask that, how does air get into the body? And the answer is going to be that it's going to be through the nose. So that's the main route of entry of the air to the body. Sometimes we might recruit also mouth to provide additional air into the body, but that's not really the normal state of affairs. That's more of a oddity or as needed basis. So we recruit breathing through the mouth, breathing through the oral cavity when the needs for breathing are not met through the nose nasal cavity. One example of that I've actually picked up here is when you're yawning. For example, if your brains are now getting signals that we're getting a little less oxygen there because the air around us, for example, doesn't contain as much oxygen as we'd like to. One way to quickly meet that need and restore the homeostasis is that let's yawn. Let's bring a lot of air in all at once. So that's why when students yawn in my class, I don't feel distraught. I don't feel depressed. I'm just like, oh, that's a sign that there's little oxygen in the air in the classroom. It's a sign, let's take a break, let's step outside, let's open the doors and get some of the fresh air in, higher oxygen concentration, and so on. Similarly, I think that the other thing that we often see, that we say that yawning spreads in a room. Once one student yawns, everyone starts yawning. I don't think that it's a psychological thing. At least I convinced myself so as an instructor. I would hate to make students bored, but I more of think of it, well, everyone's in that condition where the oxygen concentration is low, so they probably all are starting to get physiological responses that are similar around at the same time. Kind of dabbling on that same topic, like I said, we normally breathe through the nose and air passes through the nasal cavity. That's the ideal, because nose and nasal cavity serve a few different purposes that we'll pay attention in the next few moments. But when you get air in through the mouth, we're bypassing these important functions that I mentioned to you. So anyone who's gone out on a cold winter's day when air is dry, taking a big breath in through the mouth, has probably gotten some sort of a coughing fit. So that cold, dry air really shocks our respiratory system, and it's not ideal. We can do it if needed. It's better to breathe something than nothing at all, but that's not our goal. That's not the way we want to roll about. So for that reason, really in the ideal situation, we don't do breathing through the mouth. So I hope that that clarified that a little bit. But I want to start, like I said, at the level of the nose. And one of the structures that we'll see, or adaptations that we see at the nose, is going to be the nasal hair. So of course we're going to have our nostrils, and these most anterior parts of the nasal cavity, we can see hair there. And normally in the classroom, we would spend a little bit of time figuring that out together. What are they there for? Since we are meeting in this online recorded setting, well, I'm just gonna jump into that and propose it could be because we're trying to filter that air a little bit. That filtering is sometimes successful, not always completely successful, but that's where we start. So air that gets into the body, we want to make sure that we remove the biggest particles that shouldn't be there at that point. Other way how we might deal with these particles is not actually with the nose that we just looked at, it's with the nasal cavity, and especially with the lining of the nasal cavity. So let's have a look of that. So nasal cavity, which I have a small snippet of here, and we'll have a look of a little bit more of it later on, but we can see certain structures. I think that we're going to see some conchi on this one. It's just not a very clear picture, but you'll see few characteristics that are going to be important for us. You'll see that the nasal cavity is lined with something that's known as nasal mucosa. Nasal mucosa is much thinner than the skin, so it's gonna appear more reddish in color. You're seeing actually through a little bit better, and actually there's gonna be more blood supply also than to the underneath of most skin, so it appears reddish because there's a rich blood supply. This also kind of helps us to understand why it is easy to get nosebleeds, the thin mucus membrane there and the rich blood supply. So poking on there, or even if you don't poke, it's easy to cause damage. It's easy to get a nosebleed. Another thing that comes with this nasal cavity mucous membrane layer is that if we look at the histology, I've got some nice microscopic images here, we see that within this layer, every now and there's going to be goblet cells there. And these goblet cells secrete mucus. And mucus is going to be this wet, sticky stuff that lines the nasal cavity. So that's what we're seeing happening there. And we'll talk about the purpose of that mucus in just a little bit. But at this point, if you take away the fact that the nasal cavity, rich blood supply, thin walls, production of the mucus by goblet cells, and this mucus is going to be wet and sticky, you're already doing pretty good. So hold on to those concepts. Another set of structures that I wanted to highlight to you at this point is that if we look at the nasal cavity, it's divided into left and right side, and on the lateral side of each, there's these protrusions coming out from the wall or lateral wall of the nasal cavity. These protrusions are known as our conchi. And again, these conchi are there for a reason. And we'll come back to the reason, the purpose of these conchi a little bit later. I know I'm mixing up the order a little bit, but just notice that we've got this conchi. We're going to have superior, middle, and inferior conchi. So 3 different ones. I think that these views where we see more of them all at once are extremely useful as we try to appreciate actually quite a significant size of the conchi. I do want to throw out at this point just a little warning. Remember, the diagrams that we show are often oversimplified, overbeautified. There is a lot more individual variation in the symmetry of the anatomy. In human beings, we're not often as beautifully, perfectly symmetrical as we teach you on these textbook diagrams. So keep that in mind. The other structures that we're seeing within the nasal cavity, I mentioned that nasal cavity was separated into right and left side. That's separated by our nasal septum. You can really see it nicely here at the level of that we've gone with this medical imaging image. You can see the nasal septum there. You also see the huge size of the conch. You'll see the eyeballs, optic nerves, brain. You probably start to see some of the big muscles of mastication, masseter, and so on, and the large tongue there. We'll also see the floor of the nasal cavity or the roof of the oral cavity, and some sinuses showing up there. So lots to look at, and we'll come back to those and looking at the medical images a little later. What I do want to highlight here is actually in this really nice cross-sectional diagram is that the floor of the nasal cavity. So here we see the conchi nicely that I mentioned earlier on. We can see some empty spaces within the skull. We'll come to these a little later. And you'll see also the roof of the nasal cavity. There's openings for the olfactory nerves, so sense of smell nerves that contribute to that to come through the roof of the nasal cavity. But one thing that you'll notice is that the floor of the nasal cavity is formed by actually 2 parts of a similar structure. So we talk about the palate that forms the floor of the nasal cavity, roof of the oral cavity. And you'll notice how more anteriorly the palate is actually known as hard palate because there's bony structure inside. So even if you try with your tongue, it's very obviously harder. The posterior part of the nasal cavity is then soft palate. There's only soft tissue there and eventually turning into the uvula. A couple of other nice things that we can see on this diagram. Notice how nose is not made of bone. We've got some cartilaginous structures, but the bony part of the nose is very minimal, not as anteriorly. So just something to bear in mind there. Well, now I think we're getting back to kind of structures that you might have seen already on your BIO201 when you covered the different bones of the skull and when you discussed the reasons for different bone types that we see and reasons for these empty gaps within the skull. So remember the term sinus referred in language of anatomy, language of medicine, to some sort of an empty space within an organ, within a tissue, within a structure. And in this case, we're talking about paranasal sinuses. So that just focuses, we're talking on this area of the nasal cavity region, the bony structures there. There's going to be some gaps. And these are going to be the gaps that we're going to be looking at. I do want to acknowledge that I've drawn, like I always do, all of these images, and I have a frontal and side view, but probably to really appreciate the three-dimensional shape of these sinuses, we would need probably more of a three-dimensional model. So this is a gross oversimplification. Hopefully it will help you though. But what you'll see, we've got 4 main sinus groups that I wanted to talk about. Some are an individual one, some are a paired set of structures, and they're named based on the bones that we have where they are located. So within the frontal bone, we've got our frontal sinuses. Within maxillary bone, we've got our maxillary sinuses. Then we've got a sphenoid sinus deep in to the bony structures of the skull. You can kind of see it from this side view. So this would be inside the skull within the sphenoid bone, not surprisingly. And finally, some textbooks call it ethmoid sinuses, like a group of sinuses, plural. I think the ethmoid labyrinth is also a nice way to describe it. It's a network of connected spaces within the ethmoid bone. So these were our paranasal sinuses, and I think you might have heard about those, and I think you might have heard about explanation also for why do we have those earlier on, but I'm probably going to add a little bit to what you've heard before. So I think the explanation that you've been proposed in the past is that, oh, well, maybe our paranasal sinuses reduce some of the weight of the skull. So remember, if skull was solid, hard bone, it would become very heavy. It would be a lot for our neck to carry and muscles of the neck to carry this structure up. So instead, what we do, we try to lighten up the bony structures of the skull. And one way to do that would be by generating these paranasal sinuses. So like you see in the metal beams on the construction sites, there's bits and pieces missing. That's a way to reduce some of the weight without sacrificing too much of the structural integrity. That could be an explanation for why we have paranasal sinuses. Well, I'm lucky because a few friends of mine have spent a lot of their professional career looking into paranasal sinuses and researching these even as their doctorate, and there's a few other propositions why we might have paranasal sinuses. The second one that I wanted to mention was the role of them in the voice resonance. So the voice that you're used, the voice that you're accustomed that we hear, that we produce, would sound very different if we didn't have these empty spaces within the skull. So it might be that these contribute also to the voice resonance. The third one is, I think, a little wilder. I'll leave it up to you to choose whether you believe it or not, but I do want to discuss it with you. So as you can imagine, when we talk, for example, about cars, the front of the car has been decided that if you get into an accident and it hits a hard, solid structure, the front of the car just kind of collapses, and this collapsing of the front absorbs some of the impact that would be otherwise placed to the passenger. There would be greater risk of significant whiplash and so on. So it's really a design decision that the front of the car will collapse, at least partially, for this force absorbing some of these forces. So similarly, it has been speculated that if you were to fall face first flat onto the structure or have a great impact, maybe these paranasal sinuses take up some of that force. I don't know, I'll leave it up to you to choose whether you believe in that theory, but I wanted to bring it forth at least. The fourth kind of theory that we are seeing is that we do know that we can get a condition where your paranasal sinuses get inflamed. So there is clear connection with the immune system somehow. What's going on there? It might be that there's a connection there and that plays something to the functions. And since I mentioned the inflammation of the paranasal sinuses, I want to show this one as well. So we're of course talking about sinusitis. Here you see nice CT view of the skull, eye sockets, nose, oral cavity, brain cavity, and here we have our nasal conch showing up. But you'll notice that one of the sinuses is full of liquidy material. There's even some at the bottom of the second one here. So when we're seeing this tells us we're having some sort of an inflammation of a paranasal sinuses. I'll leave it up to you to look more into this if you're interested. I just wanted to put it out there. Another structure that we see within the nasal cavity, located right here at the very back of the nasal cavity. There's a little opening that runs a tube to the inner ear, so inner side of the ear on the other side of the tympanic membrane. This one has a few different names. The one that I think your textbook covers is the auditory meatus. It's important that we have this opening on both so that we can get air on both sides of the tympanic membrane. And the reason why it's important is that, well, if you've ever taken a plane, flown, driven a car to a high elevation, you get your ears popping. That's because there's a pressure difference on these two sides. And by having this direct route to bring air also to the inner side of the ear, it is believed that we're able to kind of eliminate some of the negative consequences, some of the trouble of that. So that's why we would have that. Of course, for this to work, we need to get air to the nasal cavity, to this space, to the opening. So one way we can do that is by encouraging a person to swallow. So that swallowing action. That's why, for example, if your ears are popping, we tell you to swallow to help with this balancing of the pressure differences. That's why many people find it useful to do a chewing gum when they are either on a plane that's taking off or landing or on one of these cars or whatever you wish. So that might be helpful. I'm sorry, I've got a needy child here, animal child. So that might be one thing. Other thing that we see sometimes is that back in the good days, especially before the world went crazy and saving of the things happened when you were flying, typically we did give you a little bit of goodies, little bit of treats before takeoff, before landing, mints of some kind. It wasn't really for the fact that we wanted you to have a nice, fresh breath when by the time you land and you kiss someone who's been waiting for you from the travels. It really was to do more with the fact that we promote your saliva production, which then triggers you to do more swallowing to kind of even out this pressure difference. So I hope that makes sense. So far, if we look back to everything that we've discussed, we've seen a lot of examples that nasal cavity has special adaptations, especially when compared to the skin. You remember that thinner surface. You remember the rich blood supply there. You remember the goblet cells producing mucus that was wet and sticky. All of these are there for a reason. And the reason is that we want to ensure that the air that passes through the nasal cavity has a chance to do three things. We want to filter the material away from this air, anything that shouldn't be going down the trachea to the lungs. So we did have the hair at the nostril, but that's not always fully successful. So by having this sticky layer that lined the entire nasal cavity, it is believed that we're able to catch a lot of these particles. They just simply get stuck onto the nasal cavity mucous membrane, and then you get rid of those. You might get buggers, you might swallow those, but they don't go with the air. It's like having this fly trap paper that I see being used in this part of the world where flies just get stuck. Similarly, by having this a sticky surface of mucous membrane within the nasal cavity, maybe we're able to catch a lot of those particles that shouldn't be passing all the way down the respiratory tree. The other two things kind of go nicely together. We see the thin wall of the nasal mucosa and rich blood supply there. Well, the blood brings a lot of heat with it to this area. So as air passes through this nasal cavity, it has a chance to warm up as well against these warm surfaces. So we're heating up the air. And final thing that I mentioned was that the mucus, not only it was sticky, it was very watery. So similarly, air passing past these nasal cavity structures that are moist from surfaces were able to humidify that air a little bit. So that's the functions of the nasal cavity as large: filter, heat up, and humidify the air that passes through that. So that's why we had these structural adaptations, which kind of brings me to talk a little bit about one more concept that I wanted to show that is kind of taking a step backwards. You remember we talked about the conche of the nasal cavity. And I'm just jumping back to that slide. So not only by having this nasal mucosa that was very sticky, so trapping particles, having rich blood supply to thin wall, which helped us to heat up the air, and having the wet mucus, so to humidify the air that passes through. We can do even better. And that's what we're seeing here with this conche if we try to understand what their function is. So the function would be, I would guess, that it'd be fair to say twofold. So first of all, by having these conche, we're increasing the surface area of this nasal wall. So more surface area, more air gets in touch with that, more air gets trapped particles from, gets heated up, and gets humidified. So that's the first explanation. The second explanation would be that conche actually generate very smartly kind of a special airflow within the nasal cavity. It's almost like a tornado that's running horizontally. If anyone's into aviation, you'll see that planes leave behind them turbulence. So this kind of a eroding air, you don't want to have another plane too close to that, all that good stuff. Well, these turbulence that conche generate are similar. So the idea is that we help as much air as possible to move around there, get into the close contact with the nasal mucosa. So two great adaptations there to help us to accomplish these goals of the nasal cavity. And having said all that, I'm just going to jump back to this slide that we saw earlier on. And now we're going to continue our journey to different parts of the respiratory tract. And next structure that I want to talk about is going to be our pharynx. So pharynx covers the area from the back of the nasal cavity to right before the larynx, right before our voice box. And if we look at pharynx, it can be actually divided into three different parts. So the first part, nasopharynx, located immediately behind the nasal cavity. Second part, oropharynx, located immediately behind the oral cavity. And final part, laryngopharynx, that's right before our larynx. Another thing that you might notice here is that the oropharynx and laryngopharynx are parts that are actually shared both with the respiratory and digestive system. So we have a little bit more going on there, whereas the nasopharynx is fully dedicated to the respiratory system. But I think that this is a kind of a good overview of the pharynx. What I do want to talk next is larynx. So larynx is the part located above our trachea and dedicated only for the air. There's a bunch of structures there. One thing that I do want to highlight is even though we're going to be focusing largely on the cartilages that form the larynx, so you can see them as light blue here, there's going to be a lot of other structures that do contribute, muscles and elastic connective tissue and so on. So it's not just these cartilages, but it's the cartilages are very, very interesting in an anatomical sense for us. So that's why we spend a little bit more time talking about those, but I wanted to put it out. So larynx, often known as voice box because that's where your vocal cords are housed and so on. Let's talk about it. And what I've done here, I've sketched two diagrams of larynx, one from the anterior point of view, so from the very front, and one side view where the larynx has been cut in half. So you're seeing some of the internal structures as well. Let's go through different cartilages that contribute to the larynx one by one and cover those. And I think that that will be a great way for us to review the larynx. The first one that I want to talk about is going to be our thyroid cartilage. It's the largest of the cartilages of the larynx in size and kind of this U-shaped structure. So if you look at it, it is wide, large walls, but it is open from the back, from the very behind. Other thing that you see with the larynx, with the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, is that there's this bump at the medial anterior part of the thyroid cartilage. This bump is known as laryngeal prominence, in layman's language as Adam's apple, and you can really see it on your own surface anatomy quite easily. Even though it is more prominent in men than on females, it is there for both, so you can just feel it and find it on your own, and then by using that as a landmark, find rest of the thyroid cartilage. Of course, our thyroid gland would be located at this area. So you remember thyroid gland contributing to the processes that involve metabolism, growth, development, all that good stuff. So that was the largest of these cartilages that we're going to talk about. But I want to have a look at another cartilage. Here we have the thyroid gland. The second cartilage that I wanted to talk about is going to be our cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage is further down, so more inferior from the thyroid cartilage. And again, you can see it on the superficial anatomy. You can follow from the thyroid cartilage from the Adam's apple down and find it on yourself. This is actually interestingly the only fully fused, fully circular ring within the larynx. So it is completely closed also from the back, forming the most inferior aspect of the larynx. And underneath this, inferior to this is where the trachea begins and travels then downwards. So really the cricoid cartilage is the most inferior part of the larynx. Next, I want to jump to the next structure, which is going to be kind of peeking out on this front view, and on this side view, you'll see the entire length of it. It is a structure, cartilage structure known as epiglottis. Here you can see the epiglottis. It is lined with also soft tissue on its surface, but you can definitely see some of that shape there. So what epiglottis does, epiglottis actually comes down and closes, sealing off the pathway to trachea when you're swallowing, whether it's liquids, foods that have to go down to the esophagus. The epiglottis makes sure that that doesn't travel to your respiratory tree. At all other times, though, epiglottis is up and keeping the airway open. So remember, having this open airway was a priority for us to ensure that constant air supply to the lungs. Couple of other structures that are located inside within the thyroid cartilage, kind of this space formed by it. So we're going to have two now. In previous structures, it's been just one of each, but there's going to be two, one on the left, one on the right-hand side. Two of these kind of a triangular, or if you wish, kind of pyramid-shaped structures that are known as our arytenoids. Arytenoids have a lot of muscles attaching to those, which allow them to move a little bit, kind of rotate a little bit. When with this rotation, we're getting the vocal cords that are connected to those to either tense or relax a little bit. So we're manipulating that vocal cord tension. On top of the arytenoids, we also see corniculate cartilages, one on each one. So those are worth noticing. And finally, there is going to be cuneiform cartilage inside it within the mucous membrane of the larynx as well. I'm just mentioning it for the sake of completedness. So if we were to think about the functions of the larynx, I guess that these are fairly obvious. So we want to have that airway from the oral or nasal cavity through our pharynx, through the larynx to the trachea and then to the lungs. So it's essential part of this airway. The other thing that we saw, this was where the pathway for the food and air or liquids and air separated. So whether we're going down the esophagus, which is going to be more posterior, or whether we're going down the trachea, which is more anterior. That's where it took place. The final thing, of course, is that with the vocal cords being located here, this is where the voice production started. So another important role there. And I want to talk a little bit more about the vocal cords. So let's have a look of that. So like we saw, the vocal cords attached to the arytenoid cartilages on both right and left side. They are actually elastic fibers. If you look at this picture that has been taken by putting camera down someone's throat, you can see the vocal cords here, and they appear very whitish. That's because there's no blood supply to the vocal cords. So they don't get reddish color as such. A couple of other structures to notice. The space between the vocal cords is known as our glottis or rima glottis, if you wish. Or rima glottidis. And another thing that often surprises students is that there's actually two sets of two vocal cords. So the first ones, more superior ones, are actually known as our false vocal cords. They're just vestibular folds. They don't really contribute to that vocal production, whereas the more inferior ones are our true vocal cords, made of this membranous tissue where the edges of it vibrate, and this as the air passes through, and this is what produces the voice, which of course, I do want to be fair, gets further manipulated further along at the level of the mouth and so on, but this is where our voice starts from. Sometimes we might have a situation where we have a blockage somewhere along the way higher up on the pathway, so we need to bypass this blockage, and we might need to do something known as tracheotomy. So go through the trachea to provide a direct air entry there. The struggle would be that this is the direct route also for inflammation to get to the body. So we'd rather not do it, but if we do, we try to do it very, very clean and keep the structure clean. Just a way for us to get air to the lungs if there is issues somewhere higher up on the tree. That brings us to talk about the trachea a little bit. So trachea started at the cricoid cartilage of our larynx and then continues all the way down until it divides into two primary branches, primary bronchi that actually enter to the lungs. So let's have a look of the trachea a little bit. A couple of things. I always try to do conversions before I do the class, since I was taught with a metric system. It always takes me a little bit to figure out these things in inches, but about 2.5 centimeters in diameter, somewhere between 12 to 13 centimeters in length. So it doesn't continue all the way down to the chest cavity, just to the point where it actually divides. That's our trachea, also known, I think, in layman's language as windpipe. Like I said, the only complete ring that you see was at the level of the cricoid cartilage. After that, these cartilage rings that you'll end up seeing for the trachea, they're going to be actually kind of these C-shaped structures. So open from the back. And this kind of aligns with what we saw earlier on, kind of confirming that story, but we never explored why that might be the case. So here I'm doing a sketch, which is totally out of scale, but this person is looking to the left, and we've got our trachea here with the cartilage rings. These cartilage rings provide structure to keep the airway open at all times. So important in that sense. Right behind there's going to be our esophagus. So the tube that goes from the mouth to the stomach. And one explanation I've been provided why there would be these openings of the C-shaped rings at the back is that this would allow little room if we have a large particle that we're swallowing for the esophagus to also open up to that space. But the really big thing there was to remember about these C-shaped rings, that they are what kept the airway open structurally in an anatomical sense, that we ensure that there is that direct airway pathway to the lungs. Breathing was very, very important. A couple of other things, structures that I wanted to highlight. Let's start with the division point where the trachea ends and divides into two branches, two primary bronchi that then go to the lungs, divide further into secondary and tertiary bronchi, and so on. One thing that we'll see with the trachea, it's lined with this cilia, kind of hair-like structures, if you wish to describe them as such. That's important because this actually moves, keeps sweeping material back to the throat to clean up the respiratory tree. Another interesting thing that we'll see is that the angle of the primary bronchi is different. So you'll notice, and I'm just trying to get my pen out here, that the angle of the, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's just erase that and make a different color that's going to be easier to pick. So the primary bronchi that runs to the actual lungs from the carina, you'll notice that it's much steeper angle that the primary bronchi runs to our right lung than it runs to our left lung. And this is going to be important for us. This is important because especially young babies, children, and they have a tendency of putting everything to their mouth and either swallowing it or breathing it in. And if a child ends up breathing in a foreign object, or why not an adult? Why do I say that it's always a child? It typically tends to go to the right lung because of the steeper angle of the primary bronchi on the right-hand side. So that's where I would go and look for this if I were presented with such a situation. Another important structure, just name-wise to notice, is going to be hilum. That's the point where the primary bronchi actually enters into the lung, so punctures the wall of the lung to get in there. Here I have the trachea and then the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary, and branches further are bronchial ducts, and eventually at the very end there would be alveoli. If we look in general, a respiratory tree, the respiratory tree, the bronchial tree, we end up seeing that there's some changes. The amount of cartilage is higher up at the early parts and decreases as you get further down. The amount of smooth muscles increases as you get further down, is lesser at the higher parts. But I do want to talk about lungs a little bit and spend a few moments just going through those anatomical structures. What's interesting, lungs do fill in most of the thorax, most of the chest cavity, except the mediastinum, of course, where we had our heart and the great vessels. Notice how far down lung continues also on the lateral sides. Few structures of the lungs that I do want to highlight that might be some familiar. So you remember when we talked about the apex of the heart, that was the very tip. We have apex of the lungs. This time it's though the most superior part. Interestingly, notice how apex also goes deep to the clavicle, so it really continues lungs quite high up within the chest cavity. We also have a base of the lung resting against the diaphragm, and then we have the hilum that we discussed, the site where the primary bronchi entered to the lungs. If we look at the lungs themselves, we do tend to have a fairly regular number of lobes, but remember, there's always gonna be individual variation. So if I were to do dissection with a class, say we've got 4 or 6 caviters, let's say 6, I would expect at least one of them to have a different number of lobes than what we teach you as an average. Big things to notice: the right lung is larger than the left lung. Left lung is smaller because we've got a part of it missing where the heart would be resting, this area known as the cardiac notch, so takes some of the space away. There would be very clear indentions from the heart and the great vessels and so on. On the right hand side, since it's larger, we're going to have 3 lobes, typically superior, middle, and inferior, separated by horizontal and oblique fissure. On the left hand side, only superior and inferior lobe separated by the oblique fissure. Lungs are enclosed within pleural sac, pleural cavity, made of our visceral inner and parietal outer layers. There's going to be some fluid in between, helping with that lubrication that we saw before. This pleural cavity structure also helps with kind of cushioning a little bit the lungs, and most importantly generates negative pressure that causes the lungs to be expanded all the time, as large as possible. So we'll talk about that through an example of a punctured lung in just a little bit. I think I already mentioned in terms of the respiratory system anatomy the changes in the amount of cartilage and smooth muscle, and I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the alveoli as well. Alveoli are these microscopic sacs at the very end of the respiratory tree. You notice how there's a rich blood supply there as well. Alveoli are actually, if you look at in terms of the cells, made from our simple squamous endothelia, so a single layer, so it's ease of flattened disc-like cells, so it's easy for materials to move from inside the alveoli to the blood vessel capillary of the pulmonary circulation, so that the gases can be exchanged between the two. Very thin wall. The exchange is actually driven by the process of diffusion of gases, these short distances. So we're going to see a partial pressure difference. That's the driving force there. It is a huge surface area that we have in alveoli because they're packed up so tightly. So one thing that I use as an example, and I'm just looking around if I could find a paper, but I'm not going to find. So if you have a big sheet of paper, that surface area is large, but you want to pack it into smaller space, you simply crumble it up so you can pack a lot of surface area in a small space. This concept is the same with the alveoli by having this a lot of surface area covered by making these very, very tiny structures. In fact, I think that the surface area of alveoli, if we spread them all out and flattened, would cover about 70 square meters. I think that makes 600 to 700 square foot. I hope my math serves me approximately right. So a really large area. I guess if nothing else, that's a message to take away from that. So that's our anatomy portion of the respiratory system. What I want to do, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about physiology. So we'll just jump right to that next. And while I was preparing this section on the physiology, I was thinking, how can I give an overall summary of everything? And this is what I ended up with. So I'm very proud of this diagram. It is not to the scale, it's just a schematic illustration showing you some of the main concepts. So approach it with however you wish, but I think it summarized these 4 phases of respiration really nicely. So that's why I provided it. So the first phase, known as our pulmonary ventilation, refers to bringing air from outside the body into the body to the lungs and then to the very end of the alveoli. And similarly, bringing air away from the very end of the alveoli to the respiratory tree, trachea, and then out of the body to the outside world. So simply this exchanging gases in and gases out from the outside world to the end part, the alveoli, was known as our pulmonary ventilation. Of course, we have breathing in, breathing out happening. We'll have a look at those events in a little bit. The second phase is going to be gas exchange, but it's going to be external gas exchange. So we're focusing here between the alveoli and pulmonary systems capillaries. So gases get exchanged there, oxygen picked up, carbon dioxide put out. This was driven by the concentration difference through the simple squamous cells, very short distances to diffuse, and it was always from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So oxygen gets picked up into the blood and carbon dioxide out from the blood to the lungs. The next stage kind of covers rest until we get all the way here. So transporting these gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, within the systemic circulation. And we talked about that quite a bit in our cardiovascular system chapters. So I'm just going to jump to the last stage, which is the gas exchange of materials, gas exchange, but this time between the capillaries of the systemic circulation and the cells of the systemic body or interstitial space, interstitial fluid of the body. So gases oxygen gets picked up by the cells and carbon dioxide put from the cells back to the blood. This was because we did the cellular respiration where we converted nutrients into ATP. So this is why we needed internal gas exchange, why we needed to get oxygen in the general into the body and carbon dioxide out. See, it all comes to the cellular respiration, very basic concept you learned in the class when you did your BIO181 or BIO156. Other thing that I do like mentioning is that even though I'm kind of happy with my summary of everything on these phases of respiration, be aware that it is, of course, the process works the other way around. We're bringing some gases from the body to the pulmonary ventilation and out of the body. So it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4. It could be also 4, 3, 2, 1 events. So just putting it out there for your consideration. I mentioned earlier on that the lungs were kept expanded within the thoracic cavity due to the negative pressure that we had there. If we lose this negative pressure, such as which could happen if there's a puncture to the pleural cavity, pleural lining of the lungs, of course, that would cause us an issue as the lungs now would not be kept expanded maximally. We would see something known as a lung collapsing. And that would be an issue for obvious reasons. I did want to talk a little bit about the process of breathing in and breathing out. So I would encourage everyone to take a deep breath now and then relax, let the air flow out. Which one of those stages seemed that it required effort? And if you said that it was breathing in that required effort, you're correct. Breathing out just passively, it does not require additional effort. So to breathe in, we need to recruit some muscles. And there's going to be our external intercostals, but mainly it's going to be our diaphragm that we recruit. You might remember diaphragm, this thin sheet of muscle that separated the thoracic and abdominal cavity, kind of this arch, kind of a dome-shaped muscle there that we saw. And that's the main respiratory muscle. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a quick sketch to illustrate what causes really the breathing in a sense that I want to consider it. So what I'm sketching here is a really oversimplified demonstration of a syringe. So we have something that material can come in and out, and a big storage area there, and then some sort of a leveler that we can move up and down as needed. Well, in a normal situation, what we have before anything happens, we have air, and air has molecules, and there's the same amount of air molecules both inside and outside the body, or in the lungs and outside in the air surrounding us. Well, in a normal stage, you also remember our diaphragm was kind of this dome-shaped structure. Well, when we're breathing in, we're now bringing our diaphragm downwards. So diaphragm goes from this dome-shaped structure to flatten out. So if you wished, you could say, let me get an eraser. You could say, I guess, that we move our leveler further down. So right now what we're seeing, we have moved our leveler further down. We don't have that earlier a little bit smaller space. So as we move the leveler down, these air molecules that we had inside the lung must be now distributed to the entire area. So there's going to be greater space between these air molecules. So there's going to be lower concentration of air molecules within the lungs simply because we increase the volume of the lungs by bringing this diaphragm down from the previous dome-shaped structure. So in comparison, there's going to be a higher concentration of air molecules outside in the air than within the lungs. So you remember the movement was always from areas of high concentration to the areas of low concentration. So simply by increasing the size of the chest cavity by especially the diaphragm going down, we now get air flowing into the lungs. So that's how inspiration works. If one thing you want to take away from that, you remember it's going to be active process. It requires effort. And that was our diaphragm there. So I hope that that made sense. And we're going to look at how to get air out from the lungs. Well, this is actually passive process. We don't really recruit muscles for that. That just happens because of the elastic recoil of the chest cavity, because costal cartilages and so on. So in this case, what we're seeing, we've got this syringe that I just drew earlier on. And now initially, the diaphragm was domed and we flattened it down to make the chest as big. Now that we're breathing out, when we let the diaphragm relax, it naturally returns to this dome-shaped appearance. So you could say that our leveler, or the syringe, the analog that I've used, moves back in. So we're reducing the area of the chest cavity. So let's have a look what's happening here now with the amount of molecules in the air. So now the same amount of air molecules within the lungs needs to be packed into a smaller space. So if we were to do some sort of a comparison, we end up seeing that there's a higher concentration of those inside the lungs than there is outside the lungs. And the movement was from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. So simply by reducing the volume of the lungs, now air is flowing out. Remember though that this was passive process. This just happened because the chest cavity kind of tended to return back to its shape. Of course, we can breathe out with effort. That would be known as forced expiration. This would be now this time active process because we're recruiting some of the additional muscles such as oblique and transverse abs, internal intercostal muscles to really bring that chest cavity as small as possible. So I hope that it makes sense. In an exam, I do like to ask about the diaphragm being the main respiratory muscle. I do want to be also transparent and also mention that there is going to be a bunch of other air movements that are non-respiratory air movements that are important for us to be aware of, and I'll let you have a look of those by yourself if you're interested on those. A couple of terms that I do want to emphasize, say at this point, surfactant is this lipid protein mixture, and it does twofold function. It helps to reduce the surface tension, so the exchange of the gases between the alveoli and the pulmonary system capillaries is easier because of the surfactant being there, but also helps the alveoli to maintain their shape so they don't collapse as easily. Compliance, I think of compliance simply as a measure of how much stretch a lung has. So another important term to notice. We're going to be talking about assessing ventilation as part of our lab. So for our purposes now, I'm simply going to skip over through these parts, and we'll come back to them as part of our lab part. So instead, where I want to go is to talk about the exchange of the gases and what takes place, what happens there. So you remember our external respiration that we saw between the alveoli and the capillaries of the pulmonary system. This is where oxygen gets picked up and carbon dioxide put out from the blood. The internal exchange referred to the exchange of the gases between the systemic system capillaries and the cells. Oxygen gets picked up by the cells and carbon dioxide put into the blood. So that was our internal respiration. What happens? What causes that? That all comes down to partial pressure differences. To really have a perfect grasp of partial pressures and what causes it, we would need to visit some physics. And I'm going to leave that for yourself. If you're interested, you can dabble into that. But for our purposes, just go along trusting that what I'm saying is true. The big thing there to take away is that materials move always from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And we're looking at this concentration as a measure of partial pressure. So we're looking of a measure of how much oxygen or how much carbon dioxide we have in different parts. The numbers, I'm not going to be expecting you to memorize. They're not the important part. Notice the difference between the numbers. So the air around us has a partial pressure of oxygen about 100, whereas the blood returning from the systemic circulation has a partial pressure of oxygen about 40. So you remember it was from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration that this exchange happens. So from the lungs, from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen moves that direction until the concentration is the same on both sides. So the blood that leaves the pulmonary capillaries from the lungs has now partial pressure of oxygen of 100, which is equal to what we see outside of our body. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide that returned from the body to the pulmonary capillaries at the lungs was 45, in the air around us 40 within the alveoli. So exchange from areas of high concentration to low concentration, so carbon dioxide gets put out from the blood to the lungs until the concentration is same, so about 40 leaving the lungs. The process is opposite at the level of tissues. So partial pressure 100 for oxygen arriving to the systemic capillaries, and then partial pressure of oxygen within the tissues or interstitial fluid 40. So from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, oxygen moves from the systemic capillaries to the tissues, to the cells. Opposite direction for carbon dioxide within cells, tissues, carbon dioxide, partial pressure being about 45, where it was 40 coming from the lungs to the systemic capillaries. So from higher value to the lower value until the values are the same. So carbon dioxide leaves the cells, goes to the systemic capillaries. I hope that makes sense. The big thing to notice there is due to the partial pressures from areas of high concentration to low concentration. That's how we established what gas moves where. I do like to talk a little bit about how these gases are also transported in the blood, even though it kind of delves into what we've seen before and the topics, but I don't think we ever got to this much of a detail. So oxygen, of course, you remember, was mainly transported down to hemoglobin, about 98% of the oxygen. a tiny amount, about 2% or so, dissolved into plasma. Remember, there were 4 hemoglobin subunits in a single red blood cell, so that's where the oxygen bound. It's a little more complex with the carbon dioxide. So most of the carbon dioxide is actually transported as bicarbonate, dissolved chemically into the blood. A little bit, about 15% bound to hemoglobin and about 10% in the plasma. But this 3/4 of the carbon dioxide concentration in total that gets transported in the blood as bicarb is what we're going to be important. And I want to show you this through a kind of jumping where we started. So bear with me as I jump to that slide. So I hope you can see this slide, and this slide looks very familiar, I assume, to what you remember from the very beginning when we started our discussion about the respiratory system and how it all fits together, what's important there. So we just made a note that majority, about 3/4 of all the carbon dioxide in the blood is transported as bicarbonate. So what does that really mean? Let's have a look of that. And for this part, I want to draw our attention to the carbon dioxide and water that was produced as a byproduct of cellular respiration. So let's see really what happens as we're trying to transport those and get rid of those. So we had some carbon dioxide and some water. I'm not balancing the equations because I think that would add an additional complexity that's not necessary. So carbon dioxide and water molecules can be actually converted into H2CO3, which is our bicarb. So when I mean that a lot of the carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as bicarbonate, this is what I mean, a chemical reaction. It happens where carbon dioxide and water gets converted into bicarbonate, carried in the blood to the lungs, where bicarbonate then gets converted back to carbon dioxide, and we can breathe that out. Another thing that can sometimes happen, we can also take this bicarbonate and convert it into extra hydrogen and HCO3 with a negative charge. This would be, of course, our carbonic acid. So this equation that I'm showing you here at the bottom that we kind of return to complete our explanation is our carbonic acid equation. That's what it's known as. And it explains hopefully to you how and why we say that a lot of carbon dioxide is transported in the blood as bicarbonate. So this is where all that effort that you put into studying the basic chemistry as a prereq to do some anatomy and physiology really becomes useful, and we'll see that that was useful. I do notice though, and this is my apologies, I've kind of mixed up the two terms here. Let's just change them the right way around. So we're seeing the carbonic acid here. I don't know where my mind was probably already with the spring break. So let me just correct this the right way around. So of course, talking here about our And but carbonic acid and bicarbonate. I hope that that makes sense. We can get rid of the remaining hydrogen that we're stuck with. And I mentioned this earlier on, the remaining hydrogen through the urinary system then. So that's why I've saved the urinary system in our course a little later for us to come back to. I guess a couple of other little things that I want to mention, just kind of wrapping up the concepts in a bigger scale. How does the altitude affect all of this? We discussed earlier on about this when we discussed the hormone EPO. So in a higher altitude, there's less oxygen molecules available, but it can accumulate to the low oxygen levels as this process, the red blood cell, and especially the hemoglobin concentration increases, and there's metabolic changes as well. The EPO hormone promoting red blood cell production. We discussed the relationship of this also in sports performance and high altitude training and all of that. Of course, some humans who live in high altitudes are very well adapted and used to this as well. Another thing I just wanted to mention, the control of the neural control of the respiration, respiratory rhythm from the neurons within medulla and pons. So medulla oblongata and pons, something to notice there. What's your normal breathing rate? That's something that we would normally try to figure out in a classroom together for your convenience. I'm just going to share it somewhere between 12 and 20 breaths per minute. Do notice, though, don't get freaked out if your newborn or a pet breathes a little faster. Their breathing rate is a little faster and less regular than us adults. So I just wanted to throw it out there. I normally would spend a little bit of time talking about hyperventilation, but I don't think it's going to be necessary on this review setting. You can go back to the full lecture if you're interested of that. And I think that that really kind of nicely summarizes everything that was important in my mind that I wanted to discuss about the lecture content of the respiratory system. So this is where I'm going to wrap up the lecture on the respiratory system. But like I said earlier on, I wanted to spend just a really brief moment to do a little bit of discussion about kind of in a review setting of the structures that we just saw. So let me share that with you. So you can spend more time and we can look at this in a greater extent elsewhere. I did want to remind you that smoking is very problematic. There are actual significant changes that take place within the lungs for smokers and smokers' lungs. So I encourage everyone to consider, if you're a smoker, of stopping smoking. The changes, the positive benefits of not being a smoker that take place really fast within a very, very brief amount of time. So that's something that's very encouraging. Within hours, we're starting to see some positive changes. Here I have a really nice dissection view of the that shows a lot of the respiratory tract that we discussed. And we can also see endoscopic images here on the right-hand side of normal and then swollen turbinate kind of tail mucosa. The second one is normal looking. This is what I'd be looking to see. This is not what I'd be looking to see. We can see our nose, narnaris, here, there, the conchi, the nasal septum, the opening of auditory tube or Eustachian tube or pharyngotympanic tube that I mentioned that carries the air to the inner ear. We can see our hard palate nicely, how there's bone inside there, and soft palate, no bone, and uvula hanging back. Notice how big the tongue really is. We can see our pharynx, so nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And I have another view that's kind of a nice one here. You can see the concha really prominently. You can start to see some paranasal sinuses there. You can see the large size of the tongue as well, the muscles around the eyeballs, moving those. Notice how nasal septum rarely is fully symmetrical, so that there's always some asymmetry there. Cutting further in, just to orientate ourselves, we see the brain, we see the optic nerves. What's interesting to me is that now you can see the olfactory nerves also going to the nasal cavity. Like I said, really prominent concha. You see some of the paranasal sinuses really nicely, the major muscles of mastication, masseters, and so on. Continuing even further, we probably can start to see some of the further paranasal sinuses. I think that's all that I really wanted to highlight from there. Of course, we don't just need to look at dissection pictures. We can see medical imaging of the same. So we see the concha, we see the muscles, we see the muscles of mastication, the big tongue. We see even the bony surface of anterior part of the palate, and then soft palate at the back. So really what I try to do is provide simple description first with the diagrams and simple lecture material, and then we'll see some real examples, and then we'll start to apply that to medical imaging, which is where I think many of you are thinking of heading this direction, such as that. What we see here is an X-ray. You can see some dental work having been done with metal, probably amalgam fillings. That would cause us some issues with seeing those structures. The reason why I included this is that you can nicely start to see some of the paranasal sinuses there. Of course, the monitor quality plays a role in here, but I've actually labeled them for your convenience to make it a little easier. So our maxillary, frontal, sphenoid, and ethmoid sinuses. So a good chance to kind of revisit stuff that we've seen before. Here we see a clinical condition. So we see our sinusitis, inflammation of the sinus. Notice how it's filled with this liquidy stuff. Some even on here on the other side. So we discussed about that. Do you remember we're using CTI rather than MRI here, because MRI is not ideal for bones or things like that for contrast, so more for the soft tissues. Kind of jumping back, or here's another example. Really, you can see the buildup also on this side on here. Jumping back to this diagram that we saw, a couple of things that I didn't mention. Epiglottis, so that was the structure that closed, sealed off the respiratory tree, so food didn't go down there. We see esophagus nicely behind there, and trachea. You can even see some of the cartilage rings of the trachea there. This nice picture that we've got here, a nice CT. I would probably ask you, what do you see? Well, you'll probably see our larynx. So we went through the different parts of the larynx earlier on. Here I have a nice dissection revealing those cartilages, showing that. Notice also the musculature controlling the arytenoids inside. It's there as well. The musculature controlling the arytenoids was important because we controlled now the vocal cord tension. Them all separated as a computer rendering, in case that's something that you were interested to see, a different view from what we've been using before. I don't think that I have anything too much that you wouldn't have already caught from the lecture video. Here I do have a really nice video though of a singer's vocal cord. So let's have a look at this together. It is acquired with laryngoscopy, which is a method where a camera goes down the throat and we'll see the vocal cords. And what we'll see is that the vocal cords vibrate really, come together and vibrate really fast when singing or speaking. They're actually so fast that the camera cannot quite pick it up. So you'll see a little different illustration from what the reality is. But higher you sing, the more stretched out the vocal cords will become, and lower you sing, more relaxed they are. Remember though that the voice is further processed at the level of the mouth. So high pitch there, you can see our epiglottis there at the front. You can see the arytenoids as well, not as symmetrical as textbooks tell us. The cartilage rings of the trachea. Notice how pale the vocal cords are because there's no blood supply directly to them. Here on the right hand side, you can also see some, you can see X-ray and some CT images of larynx showing also the arytenoids, the cricoid cartilage potentially. So kind of a nice. But try to peek in through that rima glottis, to see those cartilage rings of the trachea. And like I said, really nicely our epiglottis there as well. Arytenoids being moved, controlled, so they tense and loose the vocal cords. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly do. What we've got here is actually an old technique. We don't do that much. That's an X-ray where we've actually used some contrast to coat the respiratory tree. So you can see some traces of that there. The reason why I included it was that we could see the angle difference between the right and left lung and why objects tend to go to the right lung more commonly. So notice how the right primary bronchi was in so much steeper angle than the left. So typically we would end up finding foreign objects at the right lung. There's also a little gruesome picture from a surgery. It's not going to be a surgery of a human, it's a surgery of a dog. But what we see there is a collapsed trachea. So it's common in small dogs that the tracheal rings become progressively weaker and composition of the cartilage in these is dysfunctional, and then the trachea might collapse and we might do surgery if medicines don't work. But prognosis post-surgery is really good on these dogs. From the trachea, I just wanted to remind you there were cilia on the trachea to kind of move the material back towards the throat. The amount of cartilage decreased, and whereas the amount of smooth muscle increased as we moved down the respiratory tree. I think I'm going to leave the review of the phases of respiration. You can refer back to that from our lecture. And I, of course, have the exchange of the gases, the external and internal, shown there as well. Just a quick reminder here, the control of respiration at the level of central nervous system from the medulla, which was the main control centers, and pons to further adaptations and further control. Remember, this is driven by receptors that detect changes in the blood chemistry, especially the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the plasma, stretch of lungs, also cerebrospinal fluid, hydrogen concentration, things like that. In terms of the review, I really want to remind you, and I'm going to jump here from this PowerPoint to another, of the formula that we kind of created together, I guess. So it was a really good summary of everything and everything that's important. So let me share that. And you should be seeing that. So we started our journey of looking at the respiratory system simply by reminding ourselves about the process of cellular respiration, where sugars were converted in the presence of oxygen into ATP. As a byproduct, we were left with carbon dioxide and water molecules. These could be then converted into carbonic acid and bicarbonate, and that was something that we saw a way of carrying the carbon dioxide within the blood. That was an important one to take away. Kind of continuing a little quick review of the chapter content. I think the last thing that I just wanted to mention was the importance of the age-related changes that cilia become less active, mucus does become thicker, the macrophages in the lung that clean the lungs less effective. We lose a lot of elasticity, structures become harder and more rigid. The bronchi walls become thinner and collapse, the reflexes slow down. So for example, swallowing, gagging, coughing. So this might be possible issues as medical conditions as you age, more likely to get a respiratory infection with the greater age, more dead space in the lungs, so breathing is less effective. And of course, exercising is not as well tolerated either. So I hope that that has been helpful review. Here I have some of the big themes that we've looked at, and I think that we've hit home on quite a few of those. So I hope you found it useful. And with that all said, I think that this is where I'm going to wrap up the review of the chapter content. And the final thing that we have left is, of course, our lab, as I mentioned earlier on. So I'm just going to insert a timestamp here for anyone who wants to jump directly to the lab section. And let me pull up a correct PowerPoint for this portion of our time together. So like I mentioned earlier on, I do want to today take a little bit of time to also review the lab with you, and that includes touching up on a couple of parts of the physiology that we didn't talk about earlier on. So you remember the... Let me just get to the right slide. Here we are. You remember that I mentioned that one method for measuring how well your lungs work is by using a technique known as spirometry. It can be very, very advanced, very fancy system hooked up to a computer producing quite beautiful graphs, or it can be very simple tools that we use where we just get the numeric values. But what we're interested in is how well your lungs are working, how much air are you getting out, how much out in normal breathing, extra effort being put in, and so on. So what we're getting with this method in spirometry is, first of all, respiratory volumes. And from these volumes, we can calculate respiratory capacities that give us important information about person's respiratory status. So what I've done here, I'm going to show you a chart where we're breathing first, normal breathing, then an extra breath in, extra blow of air out, and then back to normal breathing. So this short little graph allows us to see a lot of things. And let's start by paying attention to tidal volume. This is the amount of regular breathing, air that moves in a regular breathing. So how much air moves in and how much air moves out as you breathe in a normal conditions. Typically, this is somewhere within the range of about 500 milliliters. So not huge, huge volumes, but volumes that are definitely worthwhile to notice. We can go far beyond that with extra breath in. If we really put in extra forward breathing in, we talk about inspiratory reserve volume. That's within the range of typically about 300 mils. So the maximum amount of air that we can breathe in if we put in the extra forward beyond normal breathing, beyond tidal volume. Same value can be acquired for breathing out with extra effort, so expiratory reserve volume. That probably would be often somewhere around around 1100, I guess, something like that. As a value would sound very reasonable to me. And there's always going to be some air that remains in the respiratory pathways within the lungs that really doesn't get fully out, or that we never fully empty the structures. So this would be a residual volume, about 1200 mils, if I would have to throw in a number of rough approximation of what I'd expect to see for that. So from these four values, we can do calculations of various different capacities. Let's have a look of those together. So first of all, inspiratory capacity was calculated by adding our tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume together. So the amount of breathing in under normal and extra effort breathing in. Our functional residual capacity instead looks at the volume of air remaining in the lungs following exhalation of the resting tidal volume. So after you breathe normally, how much air remains in the lungs after that? And then we have our vital capacity, which is the maximum volume of air that can be exhaled after taking the deepest breath possible. So that's our vital capacity. And if you add all of the measures together, all of the volumes, that gives you your total lung capacity, the total volume of air that the lung can hold. So I think that those are the measures that I wanted to introduce you and that I think are really useful. Remember, there's always going to be some air remaining that we don't get fully out, whether it's because it remains in the respiratory passages or because some of the parts of the lungs are dead, non-functional. We talk about the dead space when we're talking about this. So that brings us to have a look at some of the questions, and I think that your lab simply asks you to define what is measured with these different kinds of lung volume measures. So I've provided there my version of the summary of what inspiratory reserve volume was, expiratory and residual. So inspiratory, the amount of air that can be forcefully inhaled beyond tidal inhalation, and expiratory that can be forcefully exhaled beyond the tidal exhalation. Residual volume was the amount of air that remains in the lungs after ERV. Those could be used to calculate capacities, and I provided them there. So IC as a sum of IRV and TV, FC as a ERV plus RV, VC as a result of TV plus IRV plus ERV, and TLC as a result of VC plus RV. So we can calculate many different kinds of capacities by using these volumes. I also asked you to identify two common restrictive disorders and two common obstructive disorders. Remember that restrictive conditions, and let me make a note here for you. When we talk about restrictive conditions, we talk about them affecting inhalation, so breathing in, whereas obstructive disorders impact our breathing out. So that's an important concept to take away when we're talking of the difference between the two. Here, I do want to give you some starting points, but your own research is, of course, encouraged. And then in the next question, I asked you to look at the diagram that we provided you for case 1 and look what seems off. Calculate a little bit of the values, and from these values you could work out, are we seeing now restrictive or obstructive disorder? Simply by calculating using this little box on this diagram, you can fill in your own numbers, and we'll see that the issue is with breathing out. So this extra breathing seems extremely small. I would expect it to go much further than this. So this is an obstructive condition that we're seeing on this case study 1 patient. On case study 2 patient, let's see what we're seeing there. Again, calculate the values by using the grid that you're provided, and we'll see that the actually breathing in, the extra breathing is not quite as much as I would expect it to be. We're seeing restrictive disorder in this case. So that's a really quick, just kind of how to hit the ground running when we talk about the lab. By no means not a complete introduction. Like I think I said to you, I used to really like to do some measurements in the class with the current COVID pandemic going on. We're not gonna go there just for the safety of everyone. And this completes our review session today. I appreciate you joining me. I do hope you have a very good rest of the day. And I hope you have a very, very good and relaxing spring break. And I look forward to seeing you the week after next week. So take the next week off, no face-to-face, no online classes. And I will then see you when you get back, and we'll move on further in our course, tackling the remaining chapters, wrapping up the semester. Until then, thank you so much for joining me, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.